The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers for the third time tonight, clattering against the concrete driveway with a sound that perfectly matched my mood. Lying beneath my rusted Subaru at 11:30 on a Tuesday evening, wrestling with a transmission leak that had been dripping steadily for weeks, I wondered how my life had devolved into this particular brand of misery. Above me, through the open kitchen window, Miriam's voice carried across the night air with crystal clarity. She was on the phone again, her tone sharp and animated in a way it never was when she spoke to me anymore. "I swear, Jonathan would never let something like this drag on for weeks," she said, her words slicing through the humid August air. "He actually took care of things when they needed fixing." I closed my eyes and counted to 10, the familiar burn of resentment spreading through my chest. Jonathan Vance. The phantom who haunted our marriage, the golden standard against which every aspect of my existence was measured and found wanting. The ex-boyfriend who had somehow achieved mythical status in my own home. "David just ignores problems until they turn into disasters," Miriam continued, unaware that her husband was lying directly beneath her voice, covered in transmission fluid and humiliation. Jonathan was so proactive about everything. The house, the car, planning ahead. He never would have let me drive around in something that sounds like a washing machine on its last legs. The wrench felt heavy in my hand as I contemplated the irony. Here I was, actually fixing the problem she complained about, while she painted me as negligent to whoever was unfortunate enough to be listening to her latest character assassination session. I had been a high school physics teacher for 22 years, explaining the principles of cause and effect to teenagers who barely cared. Tonight, lying in my own driveway, I was experiencing those principles firsthand. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. 23 years of marriage had taught me that Miriam's actions consistently produced reactions of disappointment and comparison. "Oh, you should have seen how Jonathan handled contractors," she went on, her voice gaining momentum. "He never would have accepted shoddy work like David did with that bathroom renovation. Jonathan had standards." Standards. The word had become Miriam's favorite weapon, deployed with surgical precision whenever she wanted to highlight my inadequacies. According to my wife, Jonathan Vance had possessed standards about everything: home maintenance, career ambition, personal grooming, social connections, vacation planning, and apparently even the proper way to load a dishwasher. I slid out from under the car and sat up, wiping my hands on an old shop rag that had seen better decades. Through the kitchen window, I could see Miriam pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing animatedly as she continued her dissertation on the superiority of her former boyfriend. The rational part of my mind understood that some level of comparison was normal in relationships. Everyone had a past, former connections that shaped their expectations and preferences. But Miriam had elevated comparison to an art form, wielding Jonathan's memory like a club to bludgeon my self-esteem into submission. "Jonathan never would have forgotten our anniversary dinner reservation," she said, her voice rising slightly. "He was thoughtful about those things. He planned ahead instead of just hoping everything would work out somehow." That particular accusation stung because it referenced an incident from 3 months ago, when I had indeed forgotten to confirm our reservation at the restaurant where we had our first date. The place had given away our table, and we had ended up eating at a chain restaurant near the mall. Miriam had spent the entire meal explaining how Jonathan would never have made such a careless mistake. I gathered my tools and headed toward the garage, but her voice followed me like a persistent echo. "David just assumes things will take care of themselves," she continued. "Jonathan understood that relationships require effort and attention to detail. He never would have let things slide the way David does." The garage provided no refuge. Even with the door closed, I could still hear her voice through the thin walls of our 1920s colonial home. The house itself had become another source of comparison ammunition. According to Miriam, Jonathan would have updated the electrical system by now. Jonathan would have refinished the hardwood floors, Jonathan would have replaced the ancient furnace instead of nursing it along with duct tape and prayer. I hung up my tools with deliberate precision, each wrench and screwdriver finding its designated spot on the pegboard I had installed myself 3 years ago. Another project that had earned lukewarm approval from my wife, who mentioned that Jonathan probably would have organized the tools more efficiently. The kitchen light was still on when I finally went inside, but Miriam had moved her conversation to the living room. I could hear her settling into her favorite chair, the one positioned perfectly to catch both the television and the view of our neighbor's impeccably maintained garden. Another reminder of standards I apparently failed to meet. "The thing about Jonathan," she was saying, her voice carrying the reverent tone she usually reserved for discussing expensive wine or architectural magazines, "is that he never settled for good enough. If something was worth doing, it was worth doing right the first time." I opened the refrigerator and stared at its contents without really seeing anything. A half-empty container of leftover Chinese food, some wilted lettuce, 3 different types of mustard that Miriam had purchased and forgotten about. The kind of random accumulation that Jonathan probably would have organized more systematically. "David means well," Miriam continued, and I recognized the particular inflection that preceded her most damaging observations. "But he just doesn't have that drive to excel. Jonathan was always pushing himself to be better, to achieve more. He had ambition." Ambition, another weapon in her arsenal. As if teaching high school physics represented some kind of moral failing, a lack of vision that a superior man like Jonathan would never have tolerated. Never mind that I had chosen education because I actually enjoyed explaining complex concepts to young minds. Never mind that I had won teaching awards and earned the respect of colleagues and students alike. In Miriam's narrative, I was a man who had settled for mediocrity while Jonathan reached for the stars. I grabbed a bottle of beer and closed the refrigerator with perhaps more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the kitchen, but Miriam's conversation continued uninterrupted. She was deep into what sounded like a detailed comparison of my lawn care techniques versus Jonathan's apparently superior approach to landscaping. The beer tasted flat and bitter, matching my mood perfectly. I leaned against the kitchen counter and listened to my wife systematically dismantle my character for the entertainment of whoever was on the other end of that phone call. Her voice had taken on the animated quality it only achieved when she was discussing my shortcomings or Jonathan's virtues. "Jonathan never would have let the gutters get that clogged," she said, and I realized she was now critiquing the exterior maintenance of our home. "He was always on top of seasonal maintenance. He had a system for everything." A system. Of course, Jonathan had a system. According to Miriam, Jonathan had possessed systems for everything from bill paying to vacation planning to social calendar management. Meanwhile, I apparently stumbled through life without any organizational principles whatsoever, leaving a trail of missed opportunities and substandard results in my wake. I finished the beer and set the empty bottle on the counter with deliberate quiet. Tomorrow was a school day, and I had papers to grade before bed. Physics tests that required careful attention and thoughtful feedback. The kind of work that Jonathan probably would have completed more efficiently, with better organizational systems and superior time management skills. But as I gathered my materials and headed toward my home office, Miriam's voice followed me once again. "The problem with David," she was saying, her tone taking on the analytical quality she used when discussing architectural problems at her firm, "is that he just accepts things as they are instead of imagining how they could be better." Jonathan was always thinking ahead, always improving situations. He never would have just accepted a leaky transmission or a squeaky door or any of the dozen little problems that David just ignores until they become major issues. I stopped walking and stood in the hallway, listening to her catalog my failures with the systematic thoroughness of a building inspector documenting code violations. Each criticism was delivered with the casual certainty of someone stating obvious facts rather than expressing personal opinions. The home office provided temporary sanctuary, but even with the door closed, I could still hear the rhythmic cadence of her voice as she continued her comparison marathon. I spread the physics tests across my desk and tried to focus on the problems my students had attempted to solve. Questions about velocity and acceleration, momentum and energy transfer. Concepts that followed predictable laws and produced measurable results. Unlike marriage, which seemed to operate according to principles I had never fully understood. The first test paper belonged to Amy Chen, one of my brightest students, who had tackled every problem with methodical precision. Her work showed clear thinking and careful attention to detail, the kind of systematic approach that Jonathan probably would have appreciated and that I apparently lacked in my personal life. I graded 6 papers before Miriam's voice penetrated my concentration again. Jonathan never would have handled the situation that way, she was saying, apparently discussing some recent incident that I had managed poorly. He would have taken charge immediately instead of just hoping everything would work out somehow. The red pen in my hand felt heavier as I tried to focus on the 7th test paper. But Miriam's voice continued its relentless assault on my character, each comparison adding another layer to the accumulated resentment that had been building for months. David just doesn't have that take-charge attitude, she continued. Jonathan was a natural leader. He never would have let people walk all over him the way David does. I set down the pen and stared at the ungraded papers spread across my desk. 23 years of marriage had taught me to recognize the signs of Miriam's longer phone conversations. This one was just getting started. She was settling in for what sounded like a comprehensive review of my inadequacies, with Jonathan's superior qualities providing the measuring stick for every category of failure. The clock on my desk showed 12:15 in the morning. In 6 hours, I would be standing in front of my first period physics class, explaining the principles of motion and force to 17-year-olds who were still half asleep. The irony was not lost on me that I could explain the laws governing physical objects with perfect clarity, while remaining completely baffled by the emotional dynamics of my own marriage. Jonathan had such confidence, Miriam was saying now, her voice carrying the wistful tone she reserved for her most pointed observations. He never second-guessed himself the way David does. When Jonathan made a decision, you could trust that he had thought it through completely. Confidence. Another quality that I apparently lacked, and that Jonathan had possessed in abundance. According to Miriam's frequent observations, Jonathan had approached every situation with the kind of self-assurance that I could only pretend to feel. He had been decisive where I was hesitant, bold where I was cautious, certain where I was doubtful. I tried to return my attention to the physics tests, but the words on the page seemed to blur together. Outside my office door, Miriam's voice continued its systematic demolition of my self-esteem, each comparison delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had forgotten that her husband might be listening. The thing about David, she said, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she used when explaining architectural concepts to clients, is that he never really commits to anything. Jonathan was completely different. When he decided to do something, he gave it everything he had. Commitment. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire I could not extinguish. According to my wife, I was a man who approached life with insufficient dedication, who held back when I should have pushed forward, who settled for adequate when I should have demanded excellence. I closed the test papers and leaned back in my chair, listening to Miriam continue her detailed analysis of my character defects. The conversation showed no signs of winding down. If anything, she seemed to be gaining momentum, moving from specific criticisms to broader philosophical observations about the differences between men who achieved their potential and men who fell short of their possibilities. Jonathan never would have been satisfied with just getting by, she continued. He had this drive to excel at everything he touched. David just seems content with mediocrity. Mediocrity. The word hit like a physical blow, settling into my chest with the weight of accumulated disappointment. In Miriam's assessment, I was a man who had chosen the path of least resistance, who had accepted good enough when I should have demanded better, who had settled for comfortable when I should have reached for extraordinary. The clock now showed 12:30. Somewhere in the house, my wife was still cataloging my inadequacies for the benefit of her late-night confidant. Each criticism was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious truths rather than expressing personal opinions. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our quiet suburban street. The houses sat in neat rows, each one representing someone's attempt to build a stable life. Behind those windows, other couples were probably sleeping peacefully, their relationships free from the constant comparisons and criticisms that had become the soundtrack of my marriage. "David means well," Miriam was saying now, her voice carrying the particular inflection that always preceded her most cutting observations. "But he just doesn't have that ruthless drive that separates successful people from everyone else." Jonathan understood that life rewards those who refuse to settle. That ruthless drive, another quality I apparently lacked and that Jonathan had possessed in excess. According to Miriam's analysis, I was a man who approached challenges without enough force, who accepted setbacks too easily, who lacked the relentless determination that defined truly successful individuals. I returned to my desk and tried once more to focus on the physics tests. But Miriam's voice continued its relentless assault, each comparison adding another layer to the growing mountain of resentment that threatened to crush whatever remained of my self-respect. The 13th test paper belonged to Marcus Thompson, a student who struggled with basic concepts but never gave up trying. His work showed effort and determination even when his answers were wrong, the kind of persistence that I apparently lacked and that Jonathan would never have needed because he would have gotten everything right the first time. "Jonathan never would have let himself get out of shape the way David has," Miriam continued, apparently moving on to physical comparisons now. "He took care of himself. He understood that appearance matters." Appearance. I looked down at my transmission-stained shirt and oil-smudged hands, the physical evidence of actually fixing the problem that Miriam had been complaining about, while she criticized me for not maintaining the same fitness standards as her mythical ex-boyfriend. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics ranging from my social skills to my career ambitions to my approach to financial planning. Each subject provided another opportunity for Miriam to highlight the vast gulf between Jonathan's superior qualities and my disappointing reality. Finally, mercifully, I heard her saying goodnight to whoever had endured this marathon session of character assassination. The house fell silent, except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and the distant hum of our ancient furnace, another appliance that Jonathan probably would have replaced years ago. I finished grading the physics tests and organized them into neat stacks for tomorrow's classes. The work provided a temporary distraction from the echo of Miriam's criticisms, but I knew that sleep would bring no relief. Her words would follow me into my dreams, where Jonathan's perfect ghost would continue to highlight every area where I had fallen short of acceptable standards. As I turned off the office light and headed toward the bedroom, I caught a glimpse of Miriam through the living room doorway. She was sitting in her chair, staring out the window at the darkness, her phone finally silent in her lap. For just a moment, she looked smaller somehow, less certain than she had sounded during her lengthy critique of my character. But the moment passed quickly, and I continued toward the bedroom, carrying the weight of 99 previous comparisons and the growing certainty that number 100 was not far away. 3 days later, the moment arrived with the mundane inevitability of a physics equation reaching its logical conclusion. I was in the kitchen, attempting to repair the garbage disposal that had been making ominous grinding noises for the past week. The irony was not lost on me that I was once again fixing something while Miriam prepared to criticize me for not fixing it properly. She entered the kitchen carrying a stack of architectural drawings, her heels clicking against the tile floor with the sharp precision of someone who had important places to be and superior standards to maintain. I could feel her watching me as I worked, her presence radiating the particular form of impatience she reserved for moments when I was actively trying to solve the problems she complained about. "This is taking forever," she said, setting down her drawings with unnecessary force. "We have dinner with the Hendersons tonight, and I cannot have this kitchen looking like a disaster zone." I kept my focus on the disposal, my hands working to clear the obstruction that was causing the grinding noise. The Hendersons were Miriam's colleagues from the architectural firm, people who possessed the kind of sophisticated tastes and elevated standards that I apparently failed to meet on a consistent basis. "Almost got it," I said, feeling the blockage start to give way. "Just need another few minutes." "A few minutes," Miriam repeated, her voice taking on the particular tone that signaled an incoming comparison. Jonathan never would have let it get to this point in the first place. He was proactive about maintenance issues. The words hit like cold water, but I forced myself to continue working. 99 times she had invoked his name. 99 times I had absorbed the comparison and moved on. I could handle one more. "Jonathan had a system for preventing these kinds of problems," she continued, warming to her theme. "He never would have just ignored the warning signs until everything broke down completely." My hands stilled for just a moment as the familiar burn of resentment spread through my chest. But I resumed working, determined to fix the disposal and prove that I was capable of handling household maintenance, despite my apparent lack of Jonathan's superior organizational systems. "There," I said, straightening up as the disposal hummed back to normal operation. "All fixed." I expected at least grudging acknowledgement of my success, but Miriam was studying her architectural drawings with the focused attention she usually reserved for criticizing my efforts. "The Hendersons are going to notice that the cabinet doors don't align properly," she said, without looking up. "Jonathan never would have accepted such sloppy craftsmanship from a contractor." And there it was, the 100th invocation, the final comparison that shattered whatever remained of my patience and tolerance. Something structural collapsed behind my eyes, 23 years of accumulated resentment crystallizing into a moment of perfect clarity. "Then why didn't you marry him?" The words emerged from my mouth carrying years of suppressed frustration and wounded pride. 8 simple words that cut through the kitchen air like a blade through silk. Miriam's head snapped up from her drawings, her eyes widening with surprise. In 23 years of marriage, I had never challenged her comparisons directly. I had absorbed them, endured them, internalized them, but never confronted them head-on. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice uncertain for the first time in months. I looked at her across the kitchen island, this woman who had spent years systematically demolishing my self-esteem with surgical precision. The woman who had elevated her ex-boyfriend to mythical status while reducing her husband to a catalog of inadequacies and disappointments. "You heard me," I said, my voice steady and cold. "If Jonathan was so perfect, if he never would have done this or that, if he was so much better at everything than I am, then why didn't you marry him?" The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in our home. It was not the comfortable quiet of two people sharing space, nor the tense quiet that followed an argument. This was the complete absence of sound that occurs when fundamental assumptions suddenly collapse. Miriam's mouth opened and closed without producing words. For the first time in years, she seemed genuinely speechless, her usual arsenal of comparisons and criticisms rendered useless by a question she had apparently never considered. But I was not finished. The floodgates had opened, and 23 years of suppressed resentment came pouring out. "Because he didn't want you either." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, their truth so obvious and devastating that I wondered how I had never spoken them before. Miriam's face cycled through recognition, denial, and fury in a sequence that confirmed the accuracy of my observation. Her perfect Jonathan, the golden standard against which every aspect of my existence was measured, had made a choice. He had evaluated Miriam as a potential life partner and decided to look elsewhere. The man she held up as the pinnacle of masculine virtue had rejected her, leaving her to settle for the inadequate husband she spent her days criticizing. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare I what?" I replied, my own voice gaining strength as the truth continued to unfold. "How dare I point out that your perfect ex-boyfriend chose not to marry you? How dare I mention that all these comparisons are really about your disappointment that he didn't want you permanently?" The kitchen filled with a tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Miriam stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of shock and fury and something that might have been recognition. "You don't know anything about Jonathan and me," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "I know he's not here," I replied. "I know that for all his supposed perfection, he chose someone else. I know that you've spent our entire marriage punishing me for the crime of being available when he wasn't." The truth of those words seemed to echo through the kitchen, reverberating off the walls and settling into the spaces between us. For years, I had been the consolation prize, the acceptable substitute for the man who had declined to provide what she really wanted. Miriam's face had gone pale, but her eyes blazed with an anger I had rarely seen. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said. "Jonathan and I had something special, something you could never understand." "Had," I repeated, emphasizing the past tense. "Had something special, past tense. Something so special that he walked away from it." The words seemed to hit her like physical blows. She gripped the edge of the kitchen island, her knuckles white with tension. "He had reasons," she said, her voice becoming defensive. "Circumstances that you wouldn't understand." "Circumstances," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling it when someone decides they don't want to spend their life with you?" The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Miriam stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like vulnerability. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by a fury that seemed to emanate from her like heat from a furnace. "You think you're so clever," she said, her voice rising. "You think you've figured something out. But you don't know anything about real relationships, about what it means to connect with someone on a deeper level." "Deeper level," I said, my own anger building now. "Is that what you call it when you spend 23 years telling your husband that he's inferior to someone who chose not to marry you?" The accusation hung between us like a challenge. For the first time in our marriage, I had refused to accept her comparisons passively. I had turned the spotlight back on her, forcing her to confront the reality behind her endless criticisms. "Jonathan and I still talk," she said suddenly, the words emerging with the force of a confession. "We still see each other sometimes. He understands me in ways that you never have." The admission hit me like a physical blow, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. Finally, the truth was emerging from beneath years of implied criticism and veiled comparison. "You still see him," I repeated, my voice flat and cold. "Not like that," she said quickly, but her eyes would not meet mine. "We're friends. We have history together. He gives me advice about things." "Advice," I said. "About what kinds of things?" The question hung in the air, and I could see her calculating how much truth she was willing to reveal. Her hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "About life," she said finally. "About career decisions. About relationships." "About your marriage," I said. "About me." She did not deny it, which was confirmation enough. For years, she had been discussing our marriage with her ex-boyfriend, sharing my inadequacies and failures with the man she held up as the standard I could never meet. "Jonathan cares about my happiness," she said, her voice taking on a defensive tone. He wants what's best for me. And what's best for you, I said slowly, is apparently not your husband. The words seemed to echo through the kitchen, carrying implications that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge until this moment. Our marriage had become a waiting room, a temporary arrangement, while she hoped for something better to come along. That's not what I said, Miriam replied, but her protest lacked conviction. You didn't have to say it, I told her. You've been saying it for years, every time you compare me to him, every time you tell me what Jonathan would have done differently, every time you make it clear that I'm the consolation prize. The truth hung between us like a wall that could not be crossed. 23 years of marriage reduced to its essential reality. I was the man she had settled for when the man she wanted had chosen someone else. You're twisting everything, she said, her voice rising with desperation. You're making it sound like our whole marriage is some kind of mistake. Isn't it? I asked quietly. The question seemed to drain all the energy from the room. Miriam stared at me with an expression I could not read, her anger replaced by something that might have been sadness or regret or simply exhaustion. I thought you would become more than you are, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you would grow into someone who could challenge me, inspire me, push me to be better. Someone like Jonathan, I said. She nodded slowly, as if the admission cost her something precious. Someone like Jonathan, she agreed. The honesty was brutal and liberating at the same time. After years of implied criticism and veiled comparison, we were finally speaking plainly about the fundamental disappointment that had poisoned our marriage. And when I didn't transform into your ideal man, I said, you decided to punish me for it. I didn't punish you, she protested. You compared me to him every day, I replied. You made sure I knew exactly how I failed to measure up. You turned our marriage into a constant reminder that I wasn't the man you really wanted. The words seemed to hit her with unexpected force. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and I saw something that might have been shame or regret flash across her face. I just wanted you to try harder, she said, her voice small and uncertain. Try harder to be someone else, I corrected. Try harder to become the man you actually wanted to marry. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 23 years of unspoken truth. We stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island, separated by more than just granite countertop. We were separated by the gulf between expectation and reality, between the marriage she had wanted and the one she had actually built. What happens now? She asked finally. I looked at her across the space between us. This woman who had spent years systematically destroying my confidence while maintaining contact with the man she considered superior in every way. The woman who had turned our marriage into a prolonged exercise in disappointment and comparison. Now, I said quietly, we stop pretending. The next morning arrived with the surreal quality of a landscape after an earthquake. Everything looked the same, but the fundamental structure had shifted in ways that made normal routines feel impossible. I woke up alone in our bedroom, Miriam having spent the night in the guest room, and faced the strange reality of a marriage that had finally acknowledged its own failure. I went through the motions of my morning routine with mechanical precision. Shower, coffee, review of lesson plans for my first period physics class. But underneath the familiar activities, I could feel something new stirring. Not anger exactly, though that was certainly present. Something colder and more calculating. Something that felt like the beginning of a plan. Miriam was already gone when I came downstairs, her coffee cup rinsed and placed in the dishwasher with the obsessive neatness she had always maintained. A note on the counter informed me that she would be working late again, attending a client dinner that would probably run until 10 or 11. The same excuse she had been using for months, I now realized, to spend time with Jonathan. I drove to school through the familiar streets of Ironbridge, past the Victorian houses with their carefully maintained gardens, and the newer developments where young families were building their own versions of domestic happiness. The town looked peaceful in the morning light, its residents heading off to jobs and schools and all the ordinary activities that comprised normal life. But nothing felt normal anymore. The conversation in the kitchen had stripped away 23 years of polite fiction, leaving behind a raw truth that changed everything. Miriam had been in love with another man throughout our entire marriage. She had settled for me while hoping for something better, and when that something better had not materialized, she had spent decades punishing me for my inadequacy. My first period physics class was studying momentum and collision theory, concepts that seemed particularly relevant to my current situation. I stood in front of 37 17-year-olds and explained how objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force, how the energy from one moving object transfers to another upon impact, how collisions can be elastic or inelastic, depending on whether the objects bounce apart or stick together after contact. "Mr. Ashford," asked Jessica Martinez, one of my more engaged students, "what happens when two objects of different masses collide?" "Excellent question," I replied, grateful for the distraction of academic discussion. "The object with greater mass will continue moving in its original direction, while the smaller object will be deflected or absorbed. The outcome depends on the relative forces involved." As I drew diagrams on the whiteboard, I found myself thinking about marriage as a collision between two different life trajectories. Miriam and I had come together with different masses, different velocities, different expectations about where we were heading. For 23 years, we had been stuck together in an inelastic collision, neither of us moving in our preferred direction. But now the collision was over, and we were bouncing apart with forces that I was only beginning to understand. During my lunch break, I sat in my empty classroom and did something I had never done before. I researched Jonathan Vance online. It took less than 5 minutes to find his real estate development company's website, complete with professional photographs and a detailed biography that painted the picture of exactly the kind of successful man that Miriam had always wanted me to become. Jonathan was 48 years old, 2 years older than me, with the kind of confident smile that suggested he had never doubted his place in the world. His company specialized in luxury residential developments around the Lake District, the kind of high-end projects that generated substantial profits and social prestige. According to his biography, he had graduated from an elite business school, served on multiple charitable boards, and maintained homes in both Ironbridge and Manhattan. He was, in other words, everything that I was not. Wealthy where I was middle class, socially connected where I was professionally focused, ambitious in ways that extended far beyond the classroom where I had chosen to spend my career. But he was also unmarried, 48 years old and apparently unattached, despite having had relationships with women who clearly wanted to marry him. The pattern suggested either extraordinary selectivity or a fundamental inability to commit to anyone permanently. I spent the rest of my lunch break studying photographs of Jonathan's luxury developments, trying to understand what Miriam saw in this man who had rejected her but continued to occupy space in her imagination. The houses were impressive in their scale and attention to detail, the kind of properties that required substantial wealth to purchase and maintain, the kind of lifestyle that a high school physics teacher could never provide. My afternoon classes passed in a blur of equations and explanations, but my mind kept returning to the revelation that Miriam had been maintaining contact with Jonathan throughout our marriage. The casual way she had mentioned their ongoing relationship suggested that it was not a recent development. They had been talking for years, possibly decades, while I remained oblivious to the triangle that had defined my marriage from the beginning. After school, I drove home through the same familiar streets, but everything looked different now. The Victorian houses seemed like stage sets for domestic dramas I had never suspected. The newer developments felt like monuments to ambitions I had never shared. Even my own neighborhood, with its modest homes and practical gardens, looked like a collection of consolation prizes for people who had settled for less than they really wanted. Our house sat on its small lot, like a physical reminder of my limitations. The transmission stain on the driveway where I had been working 3 nights ago, the gutters that needed cleaning, the front steps that could use repainting. All the maintenance issues that Jonathan would never have allowed to accumulate, according to Miriam's detailed critiques. But instead of feeling ashamed of these imperfections, I found myself experiencing something new. A cold anger that felt more like determination than rage. For the first time in years, I was not seeing my home through Miriam's eyes, measuring it against Jonathan's superior standards. I was seeing it as the place where I had been systematically diminished by a woman who had never wanted to be there in the first place. I parked in the garage and sat in the car for several minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Through the thin walls, I could hear the familiar sounds of our house settling into evening quiet. But the silence felt different now, charged with possibilities I had never considered before. Inside, I found evidence of Miriam's morning routine scattered throughout the kitchen and living room, coffee cup in the dishwasher, architectural drawings spread across the dining room table, several outfits tried on and rejected, draped over the back of her chair, the casual disorder of someone who expected other people to clean up after her. But mixed in with the familiar debris of her morning preparation, I found something new. A small notebook, left open on the counter beside her coffee maker, filled with handwriting I recognized as Miriam's careful script. I should not have read it. Privacy in marriage was one of the few boundaries we had maintained throughout 23 years of gradually increasing disappointment. But the conversation in the kitchen had changed the rules of our relationship in ways that I was still discovering. The notebook contained what appeared to be a journal of sorts, though the entries were brief and sporadic. Most were complaints about household issues or reminders about social obligations. But scattered throughout were references to phone calls and meetings that made my chest tighten with recognition. Lunch with Jay at the Harbor Club. He thinks I should push David harder about the promotion opportunities at the community college. Says I'm enabling his lack of ambition. Jay called during dinner. David was grading papers and didn't notice. Jay says I deserve better than someone who has given up on professional growth. Showed Jay the photos of the bathroom renovation disaster. He laughed and said David clearly doesn't understand quality workmanship. Offered to recommend contractors who actually know what they're doing. Entry after entry documented conversations with Jonathan about my inadequacies, my failures, my inability to meet the standards that a superior man would have maintained. But more than that, they revealed the systematic nature of Miriam's dissatisfaction. She had not simply been venting to a sympathetic friend. She had been building a case against me, documenting evidence of my insufficiency for an audience of one. The most recent entry was dated 2 days ago, the day before our kitchen confrontation. Jay thinks I should stop making excuses for David's mediocrity. Says I'm wasting my life, waiting for him to become someone he's never going to be. Maybe it's time to stop pretending this marriage can be salvaged. I closed the notebook and set it back on the counter exactly where I had found it. But the damage was done. The entries had confirmed what I had suspected since our kitchen conversation. Miriam had been actively undermining our marriage for years, sharing my private failures with the man she considered my superior in every way. But they had also revealed something else. Jonathan was not simply a passive recipient of Miriam's complaints. He was actively encouraging her dissatisfaction, pushing her to abandon a marriage that he apparently viewed as beneath her standards. The man who had rejected her years ago was now systematically destroying her relationship with the man she had married instead. I walked through our house with new eyes, seeing it not as a home but as a crime scene where my self-respect had been murdered by degrees. Every room contained memories of comparisons and criticisms, moments when Miriam had made it clear that I was failing to meet expectations that had been set by another man. The living room where she had spent countless hours on the phone with Jonathan, discussing my inadequacies while I graded papers in the next room. The dining room where she had criticized my conversation skills during dinner parties, explaining how Jonathan would have been more engaging with our guests. The bedroom where she had grown increasingly distant, her affection rationed like a scarce resource that had to be earned through achievements I was apparently incapable of reaching. But instead of the familiar weight of shame and inadequacy, I felt something else building inside me. A cold clarity that felt almost like relief. For the first time in years, I was not trying to figure out how to be better, how to meet standards that seemed to shift every time I approached them. Instead, I was beginning to understand the true nature of the game I had been playing. Miriam had never wanted me to succeed. She had wanted me to fail in specific ways that would justify her dissatisfaction and validate her belief that she had settled for less than she deserved. Every criticism had been designed not to help me improve, but to confirm that I was incapable of improvement. And Jonathan had been coaching her from the sidelines, helping her build a case against a marriage that threatened his position as the ideal man in her imagination. I spent the evening in my home office, grading papers and planning lessons with a focus I had not felt in months. But underneath the familiar routine of academic work, I could feel something new taking shape. Not a plan exactly, but the beginning of an understanding about what needed to happen next. For 23 years, I had been playing defense in my own marriage, constantly trying to prove that I was worthy of my wife's respect and affection. But the notebook had made it clear that the game was rigged. No amount of improvement would ever be enough, because the standards were being set by someone who had a vested interest in my failure. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. When Miriam came home at 11:30, I was still in my office, working at my desk as if nothing had changed. I heard her heels clicking across the kitchen floor, heard her moving through the house with the careful quiet of someone who did not want to disturb her husband's work. But everything had changed. The notebook had revealed the true architecture of our marriage, the systematic way my confidence had been demolished to serve someone else's agenda. And now that I understood the game, I was ready to start playing by different rules. The physics of collision were simple and predictable. Objects in motion stayed in motion unless acted upon by an external force. For 23 years, Miriam and Jonathan had been the external force acting upon my life, deflecting me from my natural trajectory and absorbing my energy for their own purposes. But every action had an equal and opposite reaction, and I was just beginning to understand what my reaction was going to look like. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Miriam and I moved through our daily routines with the careful politeness of strangers sharing a hotel room, acknowledging each other's presence without engaging in meaningful conversation. She continued working late and attending mysterious client dinners, while I focused on my teaching and began quietly gathering information about the life she had been living behind my back. The notebook had been just the beginning. Once I started looking for evidence of Miriam's double life, I found it everywhere. Credit card statements showing lunches at expensive restaurants on days when she claimed to be working through her break. Phone records revealing lengthy conversations with a number I now knew belonged to Jonathan. Email confirmations for weekend conferences that her architectural firm had never sponsored. But I was careful not to confront her directly with any of these discoveries. The kitchen conversation had taught me the value of strategic timing, of allowing pressure to build before releasing it at the moment of maximum impact. Instead, I began documenting everything with the systematic thoroughness of a physics experiment, creating a comprehensive record of deception that would be impossible to deny or explain away. My students noticed the change in my demeanor, though they interpreted it as increased confidence rather than suppressed rage. My explanations became sharper, my classroom management more decisive. When Tommy Richardson tried to disrupt my second period class with his usual attention-seeking behavior, I shut him down with a precision that surprised both of us. Physics is about cause and effect, I told him, my voice carrying an authority I had never possessed before. Every action produces consequences. The question is whether you're smart enough to calculate what those consequences will be before you commit to the action. Tommy sat down without another word, and the rest of the class paid attention with an intensity that felt almost like respect. During my lunch breaks, I continued researching Jonathan's business empire, learning about his development projects and social connections with the thoroughness of a military intelligence officer studying an enemy position. His company had built some of the most exclusive residential communities in the region, catering to wealthy professionals who wanted lakeside luxury without the inconvenience of city life. But I also discovered some interesting details that Miriam's journal entries had not mentioned. Jonathan's company had been involved in several zoning disputes over the past 5 years, conflicts with environmental groups who opposed his development plans near protected wetlands. He had won most of these battles through a combination of political connections and legal maneuvering, but the victories had created enemies among conservationists and longtime residents who viewed his projects as destructive to the area's natural character. More interesting still were the financial records I found through public databases. Jonathan's company carried substantial debt, much of it secured by properties that had not yet been developed due to regulatory delays and environmental challenges. His lifestyle suggested wealth and success, but the underlying financial structure appeared more precarious than his public image suggested. I filed this information away for future reference, though I was not yet sure how it might be useful. The important thing was to understand the complete picture of the people who had been manipulating my marriage for their own purposes. On Friday afternoon, I made a decision that would have been impossible 2 weeks earlier. Instead of going straight home after school, I drove to the Harbor Club, the upscale restaurant where Miriam's journal had mentioned several lunches with Jonathan. I had no specific plan beyond satisfying my curiosity about the place where my wife and her former lover conducted their ongoing relationship. The Harbor Club occupied a restored Victorian mansion overlooking the lake, its elegant dining rooms and manicured gardens designed to appeal to professionals who wanted to conduct business in an atmosphere of refined sophistication. I parked across the street and studied the building through my windshield, trying to imagine Miriam and Jonathan sharing intimate conversations about my inadequacies while surrounded by crystal and fine china. I was about to leave when I saw them. Miriam emerged from the restaurant's main entrance, followed closely by a tall man with silver hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested he had never doubted his place in the world. Jonathan Vance looked exactly like his professional photographs, but seeing him in person added dimensions that no camera could capture. The way he moved through space as if he owned it, the casual authority with which he guided Miriam toward his car, the intimate familiarity of their body language. They were not behaving like former lovers who had maintained a platonic friendship. They were behaving like current lovers who were comfortable with their ongoing relationship. I watched Jonathan open the passenger door of his luxury sedan for Miriam, watched her smile at him with an expression I had not seen on her face in years, watched him lean close to say something that made her laugh with genuine delight, watched them drive away together toward the Lake District, where Jonathan's mansion provided privacy for whatever activities they had planned for the rest of the afternoon. I sat in my car for several minutes after they disappeared, processing what I had witnessed. The casual intimacy between them suggested a relationship that extended far beyond the advisory friendship that Miriam had described. They were lovers, probably had been lovers throughout most or all of our marriage, and their relationship was continuing with the kind of comfortable routine that characterized established couples. But instead of the devastating heartbreak I might have expected to feel, I experienced something closer to liberation. The last pretense had been stripped away, the final lie exposed. I was not married to a woman who had made some mistakes in judgment or who had been struggling with conflicted feelings about her past. I was married to a woman who had been systematically betraying me for years, while maintaining the fiction of our domestic partnership for reasons I was only beginning to understand. I drove home through the familiar streets of Ironbridge with a clarity of purpose I had not felt in decades. The time for passive acceptance was over. The time for hoping that things might improve was over. The time for playing defense in my own life was over. It was time to start playing offense. That evening, I began implementing the first phase of what I was starting to think of as my liberation campaign. While Miriam attended another mysterious client dinner, I systematically photographed every document in her home office, creating a digital archive of her correspondence, financial records, and business files. I was looking for additional evidence of her relationship with Jonathan, but I was also gathering intelligence about her professional life and personal vulnerabilities. What I found exceeded my expectations. Miriam's architectural firm was apparently struggling with internal politics and financial pressures that she had never mentioned at home. Several major projects had been delayed or canceled due to cost overruns and design problems. Her boss, Charles Redmond, was facing pressure from the board of directors to improve profitability and reduce overhead expenses. And Miriam herself was apparently being considered for either a promotion to senior partner or termination due to her involvement in some of the problematic projects. But more interesting were the personal emails I found buried in her professional correspondence. Messages from Jonathan that made it clear their relationship was not limited to occasional lunches and friendly advice. They were planning weekend trips together, discussing real estate investments that would give them shared financial interests, and exchanging intimate observations about their respective domestic situations that left no doubt about the nature of their ongoing connection. One email in particular caught my attention. The situation with David is becoming untenable. You're wasting your best years on someone who will never appreciate what he has. The lake house will be finished by Christmas. We could make a clean start there, away from all the complications and compromises. Think about what you really want from life, not what you think you're supposed to want. J. The lake house. Jonathan was building a private retreat where he and Miriam could conduct their relationship without the inconvenience of maintaining their respective public facades. A place where they could be together without having to pretend that she was a faithful wife and he was simply a concerned friend. I copied the email and several others like it, adding them to my growing archive of evidence. But more than that, I began to understand the timeline of their deception. This was not a recent development or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a long-term relationship that had been carefully hidden while they decided how and when to make it public. And I was apparently the primary obstacle to their happiness, the inconvenient husband who needed to be eliminated from the equation before they could move forward with their plans. But they had made a critical error in their calculations. They had assumed that I would remain passive, that I would continue absorbing criticism and accepting diminished status until they were ready to discard me completely. They had not anticipated that their victim might develop his own agenda. I spent the weekend developing what I had begun to think of as a comprehensive response strategy. Not revenge exactly, though that was certainly a component. Something more systematic and thorough. A complete reversal of the power dynamics that had defined my marriage for 23 years. The first step was financial. On Monday morning, I visited our bank and transferred half of our joint savings into a new account in my name only. I also canceled the credit cards that Miriam had been using to finance her lunches with Jonathan and her weekend getaways to destinations that were supposedly related to her architectural work. The second step was legal. I made an appointment with Helena Blackwood, a divorce attorney whose reputation for aggressive advocacy had made her both feared and respected throughout the region. I was not ready to file for divorce yet, but I wanted to understand my options and begin preparing for the legal battle that seemed increasingly inevitable. The third step was social. I began reaching out to old friends and colleagues who had gradually disappeared from our lives as Miriam's social ambitions had led her toward more sophisticated circles. People who remembered me as I had been before 23 years of systematic criticism had eroded my confidence and self-respect. But the fourth step was the most important and the most dangerous. I began planning a public revelation that would expose Miriam and Jonathan's relationship in a way that would make it impossible for them to continue their deception or control the narrative about what had happened to our marriage. I was not interested in private confrontations or quiet divorces. I wanted everyone who had witnessed my humiliation to understand the truth about what had been happening behind the scenes. I wanted Miriam's colleagues and social connections to know that her criticisms of her husband had been motivated by her ongoing affair with another man. I wanted Jonathan's business associates and community standing to be affected by the revelation that he had been systematically destroying someone else's marriage for his own benefit. Most of all, I wanted them to understand that their victim had been paying attention, gathering evidence, and preparing a response that would be proportional to the damage they had inflicted. The physics of action and reaction were simple and predictable. For 23 years, they had been acting upon my life with forces designed to diminish and control me. Now it was time for them to discover what an equal and opposite reaction looked like when it was applied with scientific precision and unlimited determination. The 100th invocation had been their mistake, but my response was going to be their education. The opportunity I had been waiting for arrived with the elegant inevitability of a perfectly planned physics demonstration. The Ironbridge Community Foundation's annual charity auction, scheduled for the last Saturday in October, would bring together everyone who mattered in our small city's social and professional circles. Miriam would be there representing her architectural firm. Jonathan would be there as one of the event's major sponsors, and I would be there as well, though not in the capacity that anyone expected. 3 weeks of careful preparation had transformed me from a passive victim into something considerably more dangerous. Helena Blackwood had provided expert guidance on the legal implications of various courses of action. My financial preparations had secured my independence and limited Miriam's access to resources she had taken for granted. Most importantly, my psychological preparation had replaced 23 years of accumulated shame with a cold determination that felt almost like peace. The charity auction was held in the ballroom of the Lakeside Manor, a restored 19th-century hotel that served as the venue for Ironbridge's most important social events. I arrived early, wearing my best suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained carefully organized documentation of everything I had discovered about Miriam and Jonathan's relationship. The ballroom was already filling with the kind of people who considered themselves the backbone of our community. Successful professionals, prominent business owners, civic leaders who served on various boards and committees, people who valued reputation and social standing above almost everything else. I positioned myself near the registration table, greeting acquaintances with a confidence that surprised them and probably surprised me as well. For the first time in years, I was not seeing myself through Miriam's eyes, measuring my performance against Jonathan's superior standards. I was simply being myself, without apology or explanation. "David," called Margaret Henderson, whose husband ran the largest accounting firm in town. "How wonderful to see you here. Miriam mentioned that you might not be able to attend." "Change of plans," I replied with a smile that felt genuine. I realized there were some things I needed to say to this particular audience. Margaret looked puzzled, but pleased. "Are you presenting one of the auction items?" "Something like that," I said. Miriam arrived 20 minutes later, looking elegant in a black dress that I recognized as new and expensive. She scanned the room until she spotted me, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she realized I was not behaving according to the script she had written for our marriage. "David," she said, approaching me with the careful smile she used for public occasions. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm sure you didn't," I replied, "but I thought it was time I started participating more actively in community events. You've been telling me for years that I need to be more socially engaged." Her smile faltered slightly as she tried to read my tone. That's wonderful. I just wish you had mentioned it earlier. I could have arranged for us to sit together. That won't be necessary, I said. I have my own agenda for this evening. Before she could respond, Jonathan appeared beside her with the casual possessiveness of a man claiming his territory. He was even more impressive in person than he had been in photographs, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention and respect. You must be David, he said, extending his hand with a smile that managed to be both friendly and condescending. I've heard so much about you. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and expensive watch, the subtle signals of success and authority that he deployed like weapons. I'm sure you have, I replied. Miriam tells me you two have been discussing my inadequacies for quite some time. The smile froze on Jonathan's face as he processed what I had just said. Miriam's expression shifted from concern to alarm as she realized that the careful balance of her double life was beginning to collapse. David, she said quickly, I think you might be misunderstanding. I don't think I'm misunderstanding anything, I interrupted. In fact, I think I understand the situation more clearly than I ever have before. The ballroom was filling up around us, conversations and laughter creating a background of social energy that made our small drama feel both intimate and public. Other people were beginning to notice our interaction, drawn by the tension that was becoming increasingly difficult to disguise. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Jonathan suggested, his voice carrying the kind of authority he probably used in business negotiations. No, I said firmly. I think we've had enough private discussions. It's time for some public honesty. I excused myself and walked toward the small stage where the evening's program would be conducted. The auction organizers had arranged for several brief presentations between bidding rounds, including remarks from major sponsors and community leaders. I had not been scheduled to speak, but I had taken the liberty of adding myself to the program through a conversation with the event coordinator that had emphasized my desire to make a significant announcement about educational funding. The first hour of the auction proceeded normally, with various items generating enthusiastic bidding from the assembled crowd. I participated actively, bidding successfully on several items that I had no intention of keeping, but that established my presence as a serious participant in the evening's activities. Miriam and Jonathan remained near the back of the room, their body language suggesting an increasingly urgent conversation about how to handle my unexpected behavior. I could see them conferring in whispers, their expressions growing more concerned as they realized that their careful control over the situation was slipping away. When the auctioneer called for a brief intermission, I approached the podium with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The event coordinator looked surprised, but did not challenge my presence, assuming that my presentation had been cleared through proper channels. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. I want to thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts about truth and consequences in our community. The audience settled into polite attention, expecting the kind of generic remarks that characterized most charity event speeches. Miriam and Jonathan had moved closer to the stage, their expressions showing the first signs of genuine panic as they realized what might be about to happen. For 23 years, I continued, I have been married to a woman who has spent our entire relationship comparing me unfavorably to her former boyfriend. For 23 years, I have listened to detailed explanations of how Jonathan Vance would have handled various situations better than I did. How Jonathan would have been more successful, more ambitious, more worthy of respect and admiration. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the audience as people began to understand that they were witnessing something far more personal and dramatic than the usual charity event presentation. What I discovered recently, I said, my voice gaining strength as I approached the climax of my carefully planned revelation, is that these comparisons were not simply the innocent observations of a woman reflecting on her past. They were the ongoing commentary of a woman who has been conducting an affair with her former boyfriend throughout our entire marriage. The ballroom fell completely silent as the implications of my words settled over the assembled crowd. Miriam's face had gone white with shock and fury. Jonathan was moving toward the stage with the obvious intention of stopping my presentation, but several people blocked his path as they turned to stare at the unfolding drama. Miriam and Jonathan have been meeting regularly for years, I continued, opening my leather portfolio and removing copies of the emails and photographs I had gathered. They have been planning a future together while maintaining the fiction of their respective single and married status, and they have been using me as a convenient scapegoat for their own moral failures. The silence was broken by excited whispers as people began processing what they were hearing. This was not just personal drama, it was social scandal of the highest order, involving two prominent members of the community who had built their reputations on foundations of respectability and success. "Jonathan," I said, looking directly at him as he stood frozen near the stage, "has been systematically undermining my marriage while presenting himself as a successful businessman and community leader. He has been coaching my wife in the art of emotional abuse, encouraging her to destroy my confidence and self-respect so that she would be more willing to abandon our marriage for a relationship with him." Jonathan's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment as he realized that his carefully maintained public image was being destroyed in front of everyone who mattered in his professional and social life. "And Miriam," I continued, turning toward my wife, "has been using our marriage as a waiting room while she hoped for something better to come along. She has spent 23 years punishing me for the crime of being available when the man she really wanted chose not to marry her." The audience was completely absorbed now, their attention focused on the three of us with the intensity of people witnessing a traffic accident. This was the kind of public revelation that would be discussed and analyzed for months, the kind of scandal that would permanently alter how everyone involved was perceived by their community. "But here's what neither of them understood," I said, my voice carrying a note of satisfaction that I made no effort to conceal. "I have been paying attention, I have been gathering evidence, and I have been preparing for this moment when their deception would finally be exposed for everyone to see." I held up the portfolio containing copies of emails, photographs, credit card statements, and phone records that documented their relationship in exhaustive detail. "Everything is here," I announced. "Years of evidence that will be made available to anyone who is interested in understanding the truth about these two people and their systematic destruction of my marriage." Jonathan finally managed to push through the crowd and reach the stage, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "You have no right to do this," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "This is private business that has nothing to do with anyone else." "Private business?" I replied, my voice rising to ensure that everyone in the ballroom could hear my response. "You made it public business when you turned my marriage into a community joke. You made it public business when you encouraged my wife to criticize and humiliate me in front of our friends and neighbors. You made it public business when you decided that your happiness was more important than my dignity." The confrontation was attracting attention from throughout the ballroom as people abandoned their conversations to focus on the drama unfolding at the center of the room. Someone had started recording the scene with their phone, ensuring that this moment would be preserved and shared far beyond the people who were present to witness it directly. Miriam finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "David, please," she said, her composure completely shattered. "This isn't the way to handle this situation." "This is exactly the way to handle this situation," I replied, feeling a surge of satisfaction as I watched her confidence crumble. "You spent 23 years handling our marriage your way, with lies and deception and systematic emotional abuse. Now we're going to handle it my way, with truth and consequences and public accountability." The ballroom had become completely silent except for the sound of my voice and the whispered conversations of people trying to process what they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the audience directly, "I want you to understand what you have been watching for the past several years. When you saw me being criticized and diminished by my wife in public settings, you were not witnessing the normal conflicts of a troubled marriage. You were witnessing the systematic destruction of one person by two others who were pursuing their own agenda at my expense." The words felt like liberation as they emerged from my mouth. 23 years of suppressed truth finally being spoken in front of the people who needed to hear it. When you heard Miriam complaining about my inadequacies and failures, you were not hearing the honest frustrations of a disappointed spouse. You were hearing the calculated cruelty of a woman who was building a case against her husband to justify her ongoing affair with another man. I could see people in the audience nodding as they remembered specific incidents and conversations, moments when they had witnessed my humiliation without understanding the larger context that explained what was really happening. And when you admired Jonathan's success and community involvement, you were not seeing the achievements of a man who had earned his position through honest effort. You were seeing the performance of someone who had built his life on the destruction of other people's happiness. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of revelation and judgment. In the space of 10 minutes, I had permanently altered how everyone in the room would think about Miriam and Jonathan for the rest of their lives. But I was not finished yet. "There is one more thing you should know," I said, my voice carrying a note of finality that signaled the approaching conclusion of my presentation. For the 100th time in our marriage, Miriam compared me unfavorably to Jonathan, telling me what he would have done differently in a particular situation. And for the first time, I asked her the obvious question. If Jonathan was so superior to me in every way, why hadn't she married him instead? The audience leaned forward slightly, sensing that they were about to hear the climax of the story I had been telling. "The answer, as it turns out, is simple," I continued. "She didn't marry Jonathan because he didn't want her. 23 years ago, he evaluated her as a potential life partner and chose to look elsewhere. And she has been punishing me ever since for the crime of being willing to marry someone that her ideal man had rejected." The words hit the ballroom like a physical force, their brutal honesty cutting through years of pretense and social politeness. Miriam's face crumpled as she realized that her most carefully guarded secret had been exposed in the most public way possible. "So here we are," I concluded, closing the portfolio and looking directly at both Miriam and Jonathan. "The truth is finally out. Everyone knows who you really are and what you have been doing. And now you get to live with the consequences of your choices, just like I have been living with the consequences of trusting you." The ballroom remained silent for several long seconds before exploding into animated conversation as people began processing what they had just witnessed and sharing their reactions with their neighbors. I stepped down from the podium and walked toward the exit, leaving Miriam and Jonathan to face the crowd of people who would never look at them the same way again. Behind me, I could hear the rising volume of excited voices as the assembled guests began dissecting every detail of the revelation they had just experienced. For 23 years, I had been the object of their manipulation and control. Tonight, for the first time, they were the ones who had lost control of the situation. They were the ones who would have to explain and defend and justify their actions to a community that had just learned the truth about their character. As I reached the ballroom doors, I turned back for one final look at the scene I was leaving behind. Miriam and Jonathan stood near the stage, surrounded by a crowd of people whose expressions ranged from shock to fascination to obvious judgment. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of their deception in a way that no amount of wealth or social status could repair. The 100th invocation had been their mistake. This was my response. And it was exactly equal to the action that had preceded it.